I'm Sherry Sylvester, and this is Ninth in Congress. Here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, our North Star is always to create policies that'll keep Texas Texan. In the last few episodes of Ninth in Congress, I've been going back to the root of that, speaking with people about what made Texas Texas, how the Lone Star State shifted from blue to red, from bankruptcy to global economic dominance, and became a magnet for the rest of America and the world. I want to talk to folks who were in the room where it happened. This is episode 10, and today I'm talking to media guru David Weeks. David Weeks is a sixth-generation Texan who has created message campaigns that have resonated with Texans voters for almost 4 decades. He is an award-winning media consultant who has advised former Texas Governor Rick Perry, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, former Attorney General Greg Abbott, and a host of others, as well as the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee and the Republican Governors Association. David is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, where he was named Alumna of the Year at the Moody College of Communications. He has served on the Board of Advisors for the Communications School. I want to ask him about this snippet from his lengthy resume. David was appointed by then-Governor George W. Bush to serve on the Texas Quarter-Dollar Coin Advisory Committee, where he contributed to the design and creation of the Texas State Quarter that is in circulation now. It is the most popular commemorative coin program in U.S. history. David, thank you for joining us today. What was on that coin?
Well, that was a fun committee. I'll tell you, it was. By the way, I'm glad to be here. I'm a fan, so I'm looking forward to this. It was a great committee. We had historians, we had coin experts, we had business people. Many people know here, but the one that I bonded with the most, that I really enjoyed working with, was T.R. Fehrenbach, who is a historian, wrote a lot of books about Texas history. And my father had a lot of his original first editions. And so when I started working with T.R., I took all the first editions and got him all to sign every one of them. So it was a lot of fun. But the coins, we submitted 5 examples to the governor. And the Governor Perry at this point ended up picking. But it was an interesting, because everyone had an opinion about what should be on the coin, right? Everything from buffaloes to longhorns to mockingbirds to blue bonnets to mountains but the process became fun, because it was all about Texas. And we ended up deciding we submitted 5. The one that was picked, which was my personal favorite, to me, it identified Texas, because we have a unique shape to our state. Everybody knows it. You can see it on a map of the United States. It stands out. And so having the shape of Texas on a coin with a lone star, we thought would be a great way to introduce the coin to the United States. It has a rope around it to throw back to cowboys in the early days, and they're, ranchers and farmers. And it's the one that the governor picked. And I know he had some help with that, but he ultimately made the decision. So it was fun, and you're right, it was a great success. So it was
terrific. So now we can know the story once we find those quarters. If you're going through quarters,
yeah.
I think we don't use quarters much.
That's right. That's the problem, but it was fun.
So talk to me about, we're here at TPPF. A lot of the people that work here either weren't born when Texas.
What are you saying, Sherry? Are you saying I'm old? Is that
when Texas was a blue state, or they came from other places,
right?
Like
right.
Jefferson from California. We have a lot of people, and we have a lot of people involved at TPPF from around the country.
Sure.
So people. Being a conservative state has become part of our identity.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, we've been a conservative state, and we've been a conservative state for a long time. It was,
But the Republicans haven't had power
but
that
the
long.
Republicans didn't have. But when the Democrats ran Texas, it was the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, and a lot. I mean, sure, there's differences, and I'm not going to say it's the same, but there was a lot of similarities between what conservative Democrats and what Republicans now agree on. But what happened, and of course, a lot of people know this, but it's very similar to what's going on with our party right now. The more liberal wing of the Democratic Party started getting frustrated that the conservatives continue to operate the Democratic Party. So what they started pushing more. They started pushing harder, and they started winning primaries. I remember one that I must say I should add to this conversation. I'm a former Democrat, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the early days of my career, I was a Democrat and conservative Democrat. So I was involved in a state Senate race. A senator from Abilene, Grant Jones, who was one of the more conservative members of the Senate. This was in the late 80s, and expected to win his reelection. And we got beat in the primary by Temple Dixon, our Sweetwater, a trial lawyer. And of course, our mantra was we were always fighting trial lawyers, right? Personal injury trial lawyers. And but we lost that campaign. And we were the first conservative Democrat state elected official to lose in the primary. And that I remember vividly having this thought, what is this? But this is a sign. Something's happening here. And we start seeing it evolve a little bit more. To Phil Graham's credit, he's the one that kind of got it all started. He was the first major switch parties when he was a Democrat, switched to Republican. And so it's that period, late 80s, early 90s, that things started happening. But
Let me just stop and ask a quick question. So when Senator Graham switched parties, what did he say? What was his message?
Well,
why did he say he did it? What issues mattered?
It's what they all said. I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. Every one of them said it. But he probably said it first, probably. But, the policies, the programs.
Like what? Was it taxes?
Taxes. It was. It became what the part of the liberal wing is today, wanting government to do more for you. And want government to take over your life. And it was what all the conservative Democrats had a problem with. Back when conservative Democrats ran Texas, there was never an issue with it because the liberals never had any real say. And then as they started winning these primaries and then getting elected, having shots in the general election, things started changing. So these conservative Democrats, decided, I need a new home. So the other piece to this that happened is a lot of people don't realize this, but this was in 1990. It was the election cycle, and that was the year Clady Williams ran for governor. And the two other down ballot candidates that year happened to be my clients. I had already switched, Rick Perry and Kay Bailey Hutchison. Rick was running for ag commissioner, and Kay was running for treasurer. And I was representing both of them. Rick and I have a past in history. We were both Democrats together and friends. And when I switched, it's interesting if it's okay to tell this story because I was a conservative Democrat. And I had worked with Karl Rove in some constitutional amendments and thought a lot of him. And he came to me with my mentor, the guy that trained me as a Democrat I worked for, a guy named George Christian, who a lot of listeners will remember, and encouraged me to switch parties. And I said, well, I think that's a good idea. I think I should switch parties. It's going to be hard. I have a lot of friends, but I wanted to go talk to my friend Rick Perry and tell him what I'm thinking. So I went to Rick and we talked about it, and he came to the same conclusion I did, that he should consider switching. So through a lot of effort, through people,
and Perry was in the legislature then.
He was a state rep. He was in his third session, and from Haskell. And so with help from Carl and Phil Graham and others, Rick decided to switch. It was obviously a big deal for him to switch. It wasn't a big deal for me, but we kind of switched together. And then at some point, Rick kind of thinks maybe after he's in office that he's thinking about maybe going into the lobby. I mean, he's thinking about his future, what he wants to do. And I encouraged him to run for statewide office at least once, try it. And we, of course, knew the best place for him was ag because he's a farmer and rancher. That's what he did for a living.
Right.
And so he, again, with help from Carl and Phil and others, we convinced him to run. So Kay and Rick were both clients of ours, Carl and I. At this point, I'm working with Carl on campaigns. And they're the only two Republicans that won in 90. The only ones on the ballot. The rest of the ballot, that was the last cycle, the Democrats won the majority of the races on the ballot. Only two Republicans. The first Republican ever elected to Ag Commissioner, Rick Perry. The first woman ever elected to Treasurer, first woman ever elected to a statewide office, Kay Bailey Hutchison. And they went to Austin. And then what happened after that is that Carl started putting together campaigns in all these districts, Senate districts around the state that I worked with him on, and we started electing state senators. That's when David Sibley got elected, Florence Shapiro got elected, Temple Dix. I'm sorry, Troy Frazier, Tom Haywood, Jeff Wentworth, Steve Ogden. We were electing all these Republicans to the Senate, so things were happening. That's right. So, and at this point in '94, when Bush becomes governor, he and Carl start going a pretty aggressive. Go ahead.
What was the conversation then? Was there a conversation about the state being purple? And I think we didn't always use those colors. That was fairly new. But what was the conversation in terms of, oh my gosh, now we've got 7 Republican senators?
Right. It is that things could start changing, and started having a voice. And we had 2 statewide elected. When the next cycle came up, Bush got elected governor, so we now had 3 statewide. That's sadly the only one that won. The rest of the races were run by Democrats, and then Bush went on his campaign to convince office holders to switch parties. One example was my brother. He was a district judge out of Abilene. He got elected as a Democrat, and Carl and Bush convinced him to switch, and he switched to the party. I hopefully helped too, but he switched, and there was a number of office holders around the state. So immediately we increased our numbers virtually overnight by convincing office holders to switch parties, and it was very successful campaigns. So that started the process. You started seeing Republicans get elected and winning offices, and that, when '98 came around, the last. Bullock was the last Democrat in office for lieutenant governor and of course, he did not run for re-election. And Rick Perry ran for lieutenant governor and won, and was the first Republican elected lieutenant governor. So now we have a governor, lieutenant governor. We have most of the statewide office holders now Republicans. The Senate is now moving to a majority of Republicans. The House is moving to a majority, and things are starting to happen. So that's how it got started. Another interesting story about how Democrat the state was, especially rural Texas, is when Rick ran statewide for Ag Commissioner, he and Anita had to go out and organize a Republican primary to vote for themselves. In Haskell County, there had never been a Republican primary. Mm-hmm. Even if you wanted to be, you couldn't vote because there wasn't a primary to vote in. So they organized one so that he could vote for himself. And the first person to vote in Republican primary in Haskell County was Rick's grandfather. And that's how Democrat it was. I mean, so it was.
Well, in making this change, how did the Democrats make themselves vulnerable? You mentioned trial lawyers. Was that a big piece of it? I know by the time I got to Texas in '99, the Democratic Party, all their contributors were trial lawyers.
Right.
There was no other infrastructure there.
Right. That's true. And we had a little, discussion earlier about issues that were interesting and relevant at the time. And the biggest issue in every one of those state Senate races was tort reform. And every ad that I did, every message that we put out in the campaign, tort reform issue was in it, how we needed to change tort reform. And to do that, we obviously had to change the legislature. That is, when the TLR started coming around soon after that, actually did their early ads when they first came out, TLR. And the tort reform issue probably had as much as anything on changing the dynamics of Texas politics. But what made it even more meaningful is when Perry was governor and we had the tort reform constitutional amendment and it passed. And it's we're the only state in the country, I may be wrong about this now, but at the time, that had tort reform, constitutionally, where it was going to stay, where trial lawyers couldn't do anything about it. And it was very controversial. I did a campaign in Nevada a couple years later. They tried to do it too, but couldn't get there. It was unique in that it happened, and it was probably one of Perry's greatest moments to get that passed. He was the lead of the campaign, and obviously TLR was very involved in it. But that started this process of all of a sudden people are going to go, whoa, let's go to Texas, And all of a sudden businesses are saying, whoa, now regulations are changing. It's always been pretty fair with taxes and low taxes and no income tax.
Right.
So it's always kind of been there. But now all of a sudden they're looking at it as a place to come and build businesses. And that's where it started.
And Perry also at that time began going to other states and I think that's another thing that people don't remember is that tort reform, the trial lawyers had so crippled the states that people couldn't do business here because they owned the courts.
Right.
And you couldn't get lots of counties in South Texas, particularly, you couldn't get a doctor. But you're the image guy. How did you get that message? I interrupted you. How did I get that message to Texans?
Well,
in 30 seconds.
The biggest issue was doctors leaving the state. Mm-hmm. They were leaving, and were going to leave, and they couldn't. The lawsuits were killing them, or were destroying their practices. So we most of our messaging was based on what it's doing to the health providers of the state, and how unfair it is. And boy, did the trial lawyers fight that tooth and nail. Man, it was amazing. And it barely passed. It was tough. But looking back on the ads that were, I did one ad called "Vanishing Doctors," where I shot an ad in a lobby of a hospital, and there's a doctor speaking, and as she's speaking about the issue, all the people in the lobby start disappearing. And we, of course, took a long time to shoot because we had to take people that I put them in, and it was a very effective ad. But that concept of doctors disappearing and our health, the health providers that we need to take care of us are discouraged and have no interest in really practicing medicine. So that changed completely, not only for the health, but for businesses that could come now and not worry about getting frivolous lawsuits filed against them. And it was huge. So it helped in so many different aspects of the economy in Texas.
Yeah,
so
it
really was a pivotal time.
It's really made a difference. I work on diversity, equity, and inclusion on college campuses, and you go on those college campuses now, and all the law schools are named after all those lawyers. So it's not like they have left us.
Yeah, right. Well, there is a place and a time that somebody might need a personal injury trial lawyer. So, and I get that, and that's okay. But the playing field's a little fairer now, and I think they're probably okay with it too. I mean, it didn't damage their profession. It didn't. They're still doing well, but it just leveled the playing field and allowed the industry to change and new money come into Texas. But you mentioned I did the ads that Perry used when we went into other states to convince, and we did, and it was fun because we never really put any money behind the buys. They were just kind of little buys we throw out there just to get the press attention. And then obviously what would happen is the media, say California, would just go nuts over it. And so they were taking our, puny little TV buy ad with a TV ad and turn it into a pretty huge, investment for us. It was always in the news, and of course, it was a fun debate to have because it was always a debate that we would win. Jerry Brown was governor at the time, and he was constantly making fun. Governor Moonbeam. He was constantly making fun of, what Perry's doing in Texas, taking fun of Texas, and nobody's going to leave California, and they were starting to leave.
And now,
and they still are.
300 people a day from California. USA Today did a whole piece on Californians coming to Texas. Tell me how Rick Perry, so somebody that you knew who had been in the legislature, and he seceded into the office when Bush runs for president. Well, everybody expected Bush to run for president. He had to run for president whether he wanted to or not. How did his message, how did you shape him? Because he's quite a contrast to Bush.
Right. Well, obviously that was an important race because we knew whoever won that race could likely become the next governor if Bush was successful in winning the presidency, and most of us believed that he could do it. So it became, the race that really the next gubernatorial race. John Sharp is who we were in the race with, and who arguably was then and probably still is the most conservative Democrat in the state. He was their best effort at putting someone up that is as conservative as many of the Republicans. He's just never made the switch. And so it was it was a race that, kind of came back to just Texas needing to stay conservative and be conservative, and John Sharp couldn't do it. It's one of the things we were always able to drive home is no matter how conservative a Democrat was, there was litmus tests that their party made them pass in order to move up the chain or get any good committee assignments. And those litmus tests were never talked about in campaigns unless we talked about them. Supporting abortions, all the different things, climates, everything that liberal Democrats now are dealing with were still out there at the time. And so we pushed those buttons. He may be a conservative Democrat, but the Democratic Party is going to tell him what to say. And they're going to tell anybody what to say because they're going to have to say it. And it was true. I mean, that's what happened. It's one of the things that pushed people like Beto O'Rourke in a race because he wouldn't. His position was, I'm not going to change. Well, of course, it didn't matter because he didn't have any chance to win anyway. But that was his. He didn't have to. The Democrats knew that they were going to put somebody up for candidacy that would take their positions and not cave on them. So, but it was a close race. We were. It went down really to late in the morning before we ever really knew we won that race. So it was close.
So Perry was governor for 25 years or something. He was governor for a
like
very
maybe, I don't know.
a very long time, and in many ways he redefined the office of governor in Texas. And what did he end up representing to people?
Well, it's an interesting story because he's one of the few people in Texas, maybe in national politics, you can say this about. Rick Perry came from rural Texas, right? He was raised on a farm. He went to rural high school, rural schools. He went to A&M. He got out and joined the Air Force, became a pilot, and came home, worked with his father's farm and ranch, ran for the legislature as a conservative Democrat. Well, he comes from rural Texas. Now, you start thinking about statewide elected officials, even back in the late 90s and early 2000s, that could come from rural Texas and have a chance to win.
Right.
It was rare. And so when he was in the legislature, he got elected ag commissioner, so he ran an agency, a big agency. He got elected lieutenant governor, and he ran the Senate. So he had House, agency, and Senate experience before he ever got to the governor's office. Now think about that. Hadn't been anybody that's done that. That's why he was so effective at moving legislation and moving people, because he'd go in and talk to them. He'd go and walk on the floor of the House, and because he was one of them. He'd walk on the floor of the Senate because he was one of them. So he knew how to talk to agency heads because he was one of them. So it's a unique position that nobody has ever been in, and it provided him with a kind of clarity to lead Texas that, in my mind, and I've been in this a long time, nobody else has had in many, many years. Not that it's anything wrong with coming from cities and wealthy families, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's unique that Perry had the perspective that very few of them had, and I think that probably is what makes it makes him the kind of leader that he became, and in my mind still is. I think he's still very active, and of course, when he was at Energy, he was well thought of. He won over, Democrats when he was Secretary of Energy. He was always able to do that.
Yeah, they bring a different perspective. I think Governor Abbott from Houston,
Right.
But his understanding
Sure.
and coming to office
Sure.
and
Sure.
all of his work on the court.
And this is a great background. There's nothing wrong with this, but he comes from legal, judicial, and big cities, and that's
Right.
good. That's great. I love that. But there hadn't been very many that came
Right.
from the kind of background he came from, which people. Over 50% of the vote in Texas is a real vote, as we know, and so it used to be more, but it does mean something, and it's one thing I look for in candidates. I really like to see more real Texans come out and run and get involved, and because it does make a difference. It really does.
It definitely does. Well, I've got a bunch of questions I want to ask you, but tell me this. So when did the border, if we ask, and you and I have been in sessions where polling is brought up, it's always the number one issue.
Yeah.
Has it always
No.
been the number one issue?
No.
No. When did it become important? Because there's been people coming across for a long time.
I would say that probably sometime in the 90s, it started changing when the cartels started really gaining a lot of control and a lot of violence on the border, in the border towns. Anybody my age or even younger, not a whole lot younger, but younger, remember just going across the border. Going to Laredo and walking across the border in Laredo. Just wave at the guard, just show them your license and go.
El Paso.
And, yeah,
going
El Paso.
over and
It
go
was
for an evening.
So it changed, and there's probably other dynamics I'd have to think through, but I think that the border violence had a lot to do with it, and sadly, a lot of the leaders in these border towns, we didn't know at the time, were connected to cartels. And it created a situation where the government then has to, be careful who's coming over, and they cracked down on it. But nothing like it. It was never anything like this. This is, if there's anything that's dramatically different about Texas, it's what's going on at the border. It is.
Do you remember the
unbelievable.
first ad you made on the border?
Yes. Well, I've made a lot of ads on the border. When Perry was governor, we'd go shoot ads on the border. And as we were shooting the ads, we'd see this boat coming across the border. And we're like, oh, look. When he ran for governor, we did a lot of border ads. I do work outside of Texas, too. And most of the candidates that are running, that I worked with, were the national candidates, House, Congress or Senate, would want to come to the border and do an ad. So I was always shooting at the border, and I have done work, public affairs work for Governor Tamaulipas and the mayor of Laredo, so I've spent a lot of time shooting ads on the border. Yeah, it's actually kind of fun to do it. Yeah.
Well, you talked about the quarter, and I know that you've worked with legislative candidates all over Texas. When you start thinking, it's a little bit different kind of question, but do with it what you will. When you start thinking about Texas images, where do you start? What do you want? Do you know some guys put hat and boots on? Some people, go in front of the blue bonnets.
Yeah.
What do you look for when you're getting your brilliant ideas?
Well, I'm born in Lubbock, grew up in Abilene, so my father's from Panhandle, and I've come from Panhandle, cattlemen, descendants of famous cattlemen. So for me, it's always been about the the history and the heritage. It's so unique. And again, I keep talking about Governor Perry, but his first TV ads that we shot were shot at Lampstead in Albany. And we brought his horse in and did them, we did all the, and they were very, very well received. And he became kind of known as they were called the Marlboro Man commercials. But but today, even today, if I have a chance to do something, that has a rural look to it, a rural feel to it, I'll go there every time. Obviously, we're going to need to do some things that aren't rural, but it's my go-to kind of image. If it works, if it fits the candidate. Sometimes it may not actually fit the candidate, so you just don't do it. But if there is a connection there, I think it's always resonated. And I think people, veterans, when they run for office, it's always good to do something about what they did, showing them in their flight suits or in their camo. And so it's that same kind of thing. I think Texans are proud of their history. And I think that they like seeing that, and especially in political ads, and it makes them feel good about the candidate. And it's my go-to.
It's interesting. I mean, we have the most popular cities in the country.
Yeah,
we have beautiful, beautiful cities. We have the Alamo,
Yeah.
which is what the most photographed probably
Right,
shrine
probably, yeah.
in the country. And
Yeah.
when you saw this change, you saw what you said was a sign. Your guy lost out in Amarillo, and you said,
yeah.
you see what kind of signs you seeing now?
Well, there's similar signs. They just kind of flipped. So, for example, we now elected Republicans. We're now a majority state. We have Republicans all up and down the ballot. Early 2000, Rick's governor. We have Dewhurst as lieutenant governor. We have the whole ballots, everything. The Supreme Court's all go. But there became a discontent with conservative Republicans that would elect someone to office, and they get there and they didn't do all they could do for the conservative issues that those people felt important, that were important to them. And so you started seeing a little bit of pushback from a moderate Republican to a conservative Republican. But what kicked that off was the April the 15th, 2009, I think, when the Texas Tea Party started doing their rallies. Governor Perry went to 3 of them that day, and this was during the primary election when Kay Hutchison was running against Governor Perry. During the primary, and he went to all of these Tea Party rallies. Now he didn't start with the Tea Party, but they liked him and he liked them, but they weren't together on everything. But
Right.
but they clearly, and so nobody really knew what this was going to be. But I saw, not that I had any premonition, but I saw the same kind of signs. This was like that liberal Democrat pushing out that conservative Democrat. Now we're seeing a conservative Republican want to get more involved, want their candidates to be more like them, right? So that's when you started seeing this trend to electing, and having the difference between a strong conservative Republican and a moderate Republican. And primaries never used to be really that strong. I mean, it started happening when this started happening, but the dynamic of the conservative Republicans in mid 2009, and you started seeing Republican primaries become tough, mean and rough, and that had never been the case. Typically, most of the time, somebody would defer to a candidate that they thought was better qualified and just let them run. It wouldn't even be a primary. But then we started seeing strong primary elections, and we still are. So that dynamic changed, and this is my opinion. But I think the first person to actually get elected to office on the Tea Party platform, which is not a it's the platform that a lot of people, agree with. It's just a matter of degrees, right? Was Ted Cruz when he won the Senate race. In my mind, that was and I thought to myself, okay, he's the first guy to actually win a statewide office, for his first statewide office, by the way, and with the help of the Tea Party. And as we know, the Tea Party starts to dissolve and go away in the last few years, in the last few cycles, and now we have this, still have this, interesting, dynamic between a conservative and moderate Republican, which I think we're all trying to figure out. So
it's not as visible to us, even though I was a Democrat as well.
Right.
But if you talk to Democrats in the legislature, and they tend to stay there longer than Republicans because they have nowhere else to go.
Right.
But those who are in the leadership of their party, they are always looking over their left shoulder because they have that same threat from the progressive left.
Sure,
and
absolutely.
we've seen that down in South Texas. I mean, with people going after Eddie Lucio, that was really visible.
Yes.
A couple of times with him a statesman in the party.
Right.
And would he have survived another run?
Right.
Yeah. So it's
you're exactly right. No, that's that, and that's what I've seen over the years. That's why it's not a huge surprise to me, but I'm interested to see how this is going to play out and work. And I guess it'll depend on who our nominee is. So it's the other interesting fact, fun fact, is during that primary with Senator Hutchinson.
And Lieutenant and Governor Perry.
Governor Perry, sorry. When she ran against him for governor, we had done enough polling. Our friend Mike Basilis done enough polling to know, and we asked questions about what Republican primary voters thought about an editorial endorsement, and it didn't matter to them. It used to matter, right? I mean, he didn't go vote based on what the newspaper editorial board said,
some
right?
people took it into
the polling booth, right? I mean, it was a big deal, and so this was the first cycle where by cycle I mean primary, where we decided as a campaign not to go after a single endorsement. We didn't think we'd get them anyway, but we decided not even to go after them. And guess what? We didn't get a single endorsement. Senator got every one of them, every newspaper in the state. They did ads on it. They did newspaper, TV. And we were just watching this going, okay, if we're right, then this is going to be good. If we're wrong, we're in real trouble. But we were right. And I think, that helped solidify Rick's conservative credentials, and to speak to Republican primary voters, like, okay, I get it. This doesn't matter. What matters is leadership, and what matters is where you are policy-wise, where your moral compass is, and so we don't care what a newspaper thinks anymore. So, but it was interesting to see that change. Having been, I was a former press aide, speechwriter, and worked a lot with, the press and newspapers, and always, been, very fond of newspapers and newspaper journalists. So my degree's in journalism, but I never went into journalism. But anyway,
so that's a whole other podcast that we've got to do about. We've got to do about journalism.
Right.
They're so it's so hard for them to realize that it really doesn't matter what they write anymore.
No. Right.
Wrapping up, biggest surprise in your career. Something that you didn't think was going to happen that happened.
Well, so this is, there's a lot really, but this is one that I thought was pretty unique. How much time do I have? A few minutes?
Yeah.
I was working with Barry Williamson, who was running for a railroad commissioner. Carl was working with me, and we were running against Lena Guerrera. Who was the Democrat. Now, she was the railroad commissioner and appointed a railroad commissioner, and we were running against her. And during the campaign, all her campaign materials all talked about her being a graduate of the University of Texas. And someone along the road found out that she actually did not graduate from the University of Texas. And so the press went to her and she, oh yeah, I'm sorry that some aide put that in that brochure. It wasn't supposed to be there. But yeah, no, I knew I wasn't, and it was a big deal. But yet there was still this cynicism. And so we went and researched and found some video where she was speaking to graduation classes of two universities, one San Marcos, and I think the other was not A&M, but where she said in her statement, I remember well my graduation. I remember when I graduated from the university. And so clearly it was in her head. So we turned that into an ad, and an attack ad. And I don't call them negative advertising. I call it attack ad. And when it aired, it happened so fast that it turned so quickly. She resigned. She resigned from her railroad commission job. She left it. Now, to her credit, she stayed in the race, but she left the commission, and we ended up winning. And it was a kind of a interesting dynamic in that it's just something you didn't expect, right? You wouldn't expect somebody to actually resign over an ad that really just said, you're fibbing a little bit on your graduation. But it was something that has been talked about a lot over the years. But as I finish that story, I want to say that she went back to university, got her degree, and she became a very prominent lobbyist. Sadly, she passed, but I had a lot of respect for her, how she handled it after that race and what she did with her life. It was very interesting.
So in a couple of minutes, looking at politics today, if somebody came to you and said, David, I just really like what you're doing, and I'd really like to be involved in messaging and political campaigns, thinking about how much they've changed over the years, what would you advise? What would you say to that person?
Well, hopefully they have some background in it, but even if they don't, I always tell them to go volunteer for campaigns and work in campaigns and find what you want to do in a campaign. If you love it and you become good at it, you'll find your niche and you will keep being hired. And because we need young people coming into the business, and if you have a background in communications, then study the art. There's a lot of examples out there, and just become that person that deep dives into the whole communications piece. It's changed a lot. We didn't have the digital piece we have now. We didn't have the social media we have now. But that's a good thing. I mean, all of it's a good thing because it reaches more voters. So understanding all those dynamics, learning the business. You have to learn the business. You have to understand what a campaign is. Not just, I was a press aide and speechwriter long before I did TV. And I worked in campaigns, did everything from driving the candidates to making coffee to running errands you just do it. And it will pay off if that's what you want to do. So,
it's also a way of finding out it is addictive. It's either works for you or if it doesn't.
Right.
That's why do you think they use the term political junkie?
You're right.
It really is.
Well, you're making a difference. You really do.
You really are.
Do. Yeah.
And we need more clear communicators going forward.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much for coming by Ninth in Congress.
Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us today. You can subscribe to the Ninth in Congress podcast at Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Sylvester1630. And if you want to receive the Ninth in Congress newsletter, you can sign up at TPPF, the TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com.